Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
So we are now being recorded. So welcome to Stoneridge's first quarterly installment of our speaker series. Today's speakers are Mike Dordick. He's the president of McBee Associates. They're a financial and clinical consulting firm. Bruenderman is also with us. He's a partner with Stoneridge Partners. He's our executive vice president. Tom Lillis is also a partner with our Stoneridge Strategic Consulting Group. And myself, I'm a partner in the president of Stoneridge. Today we'll be doing a market update. We are going to be doing these, obviously this is called the Stoneridge Speaker Series. We're going to be doing this quarterly going forward, and we're excited to kick this off today. We will also be doing other relevant topics in between these quarterly market M&A updates. So as I stated before, these will be recorded on our website. So if you people who missed this, or if you wanted to listen to this going forward, it will be out there in a couple days. So we'll send out a blast and email to the folks. So welcome to everybody. This webinar will focus on current valuation trends, deal flow, PDGM, COVID, and regulatory changes affecting home health, home care, hospice, and behavioral health, which are our verticals that we focus on here at Stoneridge. It's been very busy here, right? So our deal flow has continued to be strong. We've continued to close deals the last several weeks in all of our verticals, albeit with a lot of effort and a different deal pace. The shelter in place, as you can probably imagine, has created a lot of effort to get deals done, and has created a lot of problems with doing due diligence. So depending on each type of vertical and each type of transaction, valuations have changed a little bit, but valuations have stayed steady and actually are now starting to show some signs of bouncing back in certain verticals. The guys will dive more into these topics as they go forward. But it's been very interesting times, to say the least, and we're excited to start feeling like we're bouncing back. So let me first start by welcoming everybody, our participants and our guests, and wishing everybody that I hope everybody has stayed healthy through the last several weeks, and just happy that everybody is here. This is obviously a webinar, but our process is a fireside chat, so it's a very casual process. I will be moderating, asking these three experts in their fields questions. It'll be a conversation. You all have the ability to chat with me and ask questions that I will ask them. I have a set of questions after their intros to go through, but if you have them, please get them. You'll see me write them down, and if time allows, we'll hopefully get through all of them. We have about 30 to 40 minutes of prepared comments and Q&A, and then we'll move right into your all's Q&A questions as well. And then obviously this is recorded. So without further ado, we'll go through introductions. So let's start with Mike first. Like I said, Mike is with McBee Associates. Our relationship with them is they are an outside firm that provides due diligence to a lot of our, they provide the work to our clients, typically for the buyers looking at our clients on sell-side transactions through the M&A process. Mike, how about introducing yourself? Tell us a little about your firm and some intro comments on the market.
Sure. Thanks, Rich. And I want to first of all, thank you and the Stoneridge team for having me join this session today. It should be an interesting dynamic. We are at a very unique time, and especially in the M&A space with stay-at-home orders and COVID, a little bit different than what we've seen in a market that was really, really strong. But by background, so my name is Mike Dordick. I'm the president of McBee. I also have a dual role. I'm also SVP of post-acute strategy for NetSmart since McBee was acquired by NetSmart. I've been with McBee for 25 years and have spent more than 15 of that deep into the transactional M&A space. A couple of the key transactions, I mean, our McBee's transactional work goes back to about more than 15 years, going back to when Gentiva bought Healthfield and had dealt with a lot of the Gentiva transactions, including Kindred and some of the other pieces that had taken place. I've also recently worked on the Amedisys AseraCare deal, which we saw recently get transacted during COVID, and the Asana deal. Worked heavily within Compass, with Alacare and Camellia. And also with BrightSpring, ResCare on the PharMerica and Advanced deals. We also have done, as a firm, do a lot of work on the sell side, preparing for transactions. We had done that work for Alacare before they went to market, for Bristol Hospice, and as well as many others, including AseraCare. So we do work both for these strategic parties as well as private equity. We do a number of projects with private equity firms looking to enter. So I'm happy to share my experience with the group today.
Thanks, Mike. Brian,
Sure. Brian Bruenderman. I'm a partner here at Stoneridge. I've been with Stoneridge going up on better part of 10 years, helping people plan for and execute exit strategies. Prior to that, I spent most of my career in corporate development, buying the same types of companies I help sell now. So it is an interesting time. I'll echo Mike's comments, particularly as it relates to diligence and some of the interesting PPP loans, to everything from PPP loans to temporary rate relief increases. We're in uncharted territory for sure. We have seen a tremendous amount of ongoing deal flow, at least a surprising amount, but we're doing them in a different way than we have before. And that's determined, it's forcing buyers and sellers to work more collaboratively than they ever have previously. So thanks for having me. I'd see a lot of familiar names on there. Just so you guys know, I can't see when you fall asleep. So it's much better. For you, it's probably much better than when I talk to you in person. So I'll turn it over to Tom to introduce himself as well.
Thank you, Brian. Tom Lillis with Stoneridge Partners. I am the partner that runs the strategic consulting group. I'm the new kid on the block. Previous to being with Stoneridge, I actually worked with Mike in the executive leadership at McBee on 2 different chapters over 15 years. And previous to that, as my hairline will no doubt attest, a longer career, worked with HB Consulting and KPMG and other firms as well. To no surprise, I think, to anybody on this call, it's interesting market times we're seeing, and really by market segment, I know, Rich, we're going to get into different impacts in different market segments. That's been really interesting. Some markets, it's as if COVID didn't even happen, but the majority of them, we're seeing direct impact to COVID. And obviously, we'll hope we can cover what folks can do to address that.
Thanks, Tom. We're excited. Tom joined us last year to help us kick off our strategic consulting group. So welcome, Tom, to the Stoneridge team. We're very excited to have you and have your expertise with us. So let's kick off with the first question, and let's address it to both Mike and Brian. Going forward now and going forward, who do you see as being more active in buyers, strategic or private equity companies the current, I was going to say post-COVID world. I'm not sure we're quite post-COVID yet, but in today's world and going through the COVID world, who do you see as being more active, strategic or private equity, and why? And let's start with Mike.
Thanks. So Rich, I think that it's a kind of a 2-tiered question. So I think you're going to see, I'll start with the strategics, depending on the line in the market that they're in. So if you look at groups like hospice that has been really hot going so the end of last year into the early part of this year, you're going to see that remain hot. And you'll see both groups, both strategics and private equity enter or expand their markets. We may see valuations change there, but I do believe when you look at hospice overall, you will see things change. Now, what we've also seen happen in hospice as we're talking through that, you are going to start seeing groups that are private equity backed. If you look at access to capital, may slow a little bit, but there you'll still see significant activity. When you get into certified home care, and you look at especially those same strategics, they're going to see them be really opportunistic. They're going to look at markets that they need to get into, and they're going to look at CONs. But in the scenarios of where you would have seen this go pre-PDGM, you expected once PDGM leveled off, you'd see some entry into some of those places. I think a number of these key strategics that I've been talking to are really going to weigh heavily and look how they're going to go at things strategically. Private equity is different. Again, if some of the private equity firms have their funds ready to go, they're going to be really opportunistic on getting into certified home care where they may have done it differently before. And with strategics especially, with private equity especially, if they have the money to go after it, they're going to try to look at things and maybe be able to pick up things at a better valuation as prior. So you're going to see a different market. When you get into the non-certified home care, the Medicaid businesses, that'll be a little bit different. You're seeing that business there. I think there's going to be a lot of expansion. I know Brian's going to hit on some of those areas, but you really will see that a number of the key private equity dollars may go into that space.
Brian?
Yeah, I think I'll just following up on what Mike said. I think I'll agree with Mike on the hospice. I don't think it's had a tremendous effect on valuations yet. I'm not sure how that continues, but there's certainly still a strong interest. And my conversations with strategic buyers as far as Medicare home health is much like as Mike summarized it. I think they become more selective, especially as the full effects of PDGM kind of coincided with the COVID effects. We're seeing a lot of strategics who've actually developed a process and a team to do, for lack of a better term. We've done several of these, or we've assisted with several of these. I don't know, Tom, if we have a better word for it. I'll call it an assumption of care, where sizable agencies have just determined that it's cheaper to transfer their assets to a more stable provider or larger provider than it is to close, and really even more humane because they're not putting people out of work in this environment. So that I think that for pure acquisitions, I think we'll see them strategics particularly be more selective. How that affects valuations, I think remains to be seen. And equity groups might see that as an opportunity and continue to enter the market that way. Specific to Medicaid personal care, we've seen a tremendous amount of activity. To be honest with you, that as an aversion to skilled nursing facilities has sort of become more common. Those businesses, the ones that transactions I've worked with, have actually seen growth through this process. And because if you need help, you're not going to a nursing home. And so we've actually seen I've seen companies that I'm assisting who are in diligence or were in diligence prior to this happening have actually grown through the process. And that part of that has to do with the availability of staff, with record number of people unemployed. And one of the challenges to growth in that space has always been finding direct care staff. And that's become a lot less of a problem. The problems have become in that space and specific to diligence is, how do you handle these PPP loans, or how do you handle these states where they provided temporary rate increases, and how long do they go on, and how does that affect valuation? So there's a lot of question marks around that, and it's really kind of, I think it's forced a lot of people to kind of pump the brakes on transactions in that space and maybe take a step back. I do think that there'll be an opportunity to get a lot of small add-on acquisitions at good values, particularly if some of the states start to see some rate pressure, or start to exhibit some rate pressures as a result of all these funds flowing out to unemployment and other assistance programs. And IDDD, I think it's a little early to tell, but we've seen a strong amount of interest in the behavioral health side. That has, other than the day service programs, those have probably seen the least effect of the segments that I work in. but most of the states have exhibited some flexibility on that because, frankly, there's just not a lot of options. So that we still see a very, very strong interest in the stability that segment offers. So I'd see that continuing as well.
Yeah, and we're seeing that across the board, Brian, on all of our behavioral health, developmental disabilities, along with our addiction treatment and our MAT programs as well. Tom, how about you, just on the broader landscape over the last 90 days and the next 90 days, what do you see from your perspective?
Sure. It's obviously echo what Mike and Brian, I think, and most folks on the call would understand. It's interesting, right? So first 30 to 45 days from the general shutdown of the economy, it was this collective punch or pause button, and we are seeing folks come out. I'll echo again the uncertainty on payment structures, how long, to what degree. That's going to make valuations difficult. As tough as it is, I think folks they've got to decide if they want to. Hey, Brian, if they're looking and serious about perhaps a transition of ownership of one sort, they kind of need to take a step back, pull the lens back a little bit, and what positions them in the best possible way. So you be proactive. Don't wait for the serious discussions to begin. But if you can do some clinical reviews, rev cycle reviews, operational reviews, and get that stuff taken care of on the front end, that's going to be really beneficial to the organizations.
So diving in a little bit more, Tom, internally and externally, if you want to be more successful, what should you be doing? If you want to open up the hood and look in, what would you be doing today if you wanted to be more successful for a transaction going forward, or just for your business in general?
Yeah. So some of the stuff that Stoneridge does, we're gonna sit down and strategically look at your markets, both geography and what market segments you're in. We're gonna see what the opportunities are there, both for the current owners or if they're selling, and how to value those, and with the change in the landscape. That's going to be an interesting, continually evolving process. As one of the things Brian talked about is companion care or private duty care. That's we're seeing a real uptick in that. That would not have been as anticipated, say, 4 months ago. From a traditional or Medicare-centric home health provider, you're certainly going to want to look at your clinical records and do a deep dive. Have somebody, an independent organization like a McBee, for instance. They're well known for reviewing those clinical charts to make sure that there's nothing in the charts that would give the buyer pause. That's one of the first things that we would look at. Is you're going to want to do a representative sample so that doesn't create a stumbling block as you get into these discussions. You want to minimize the surprises as you go through that.
I'll echo, Tom, I'll echo that as well, and I'll encourage the kinds of services, Mike, that you provide, because buyers, particularly in the Medicare home health space, but really across the board, are becoming, I think they're going to emerge from this much more selective and much more critical when it comes to compliance. So I don't think too often these transactions that have continued through this crisis, we're hitting stumbling blocks because, frankly, the providers just weren't ready from a compliance standpoint. And I know that the kind of pre-diligence that a group like McBee or can do, or even be done internally, is proven really valuable because you go into that thing sort of armed with sort of those surprises, and it doesn't take much because there's a lot of inventory out there and there aren't quite as many buyers, particularly in the Medicare home health space. I think it doesn't take much for them to walk away and pursue a different asset if there are any perceived problems. Mike, I don't know what you're seeing.
Yeah, but I think it's a really important point to understand what you're getting into before you go to market, because if you don't, I mean, I end up in more transactions that buyers find something, sellers are surprised by a piece of the business in clinical when you do a deep dive on the compliance to the Medicare participation or billing requirements that you could have found out before you went to market. and corrected and then disclosed in that process, where you won't have a deal go sideways after you spend a lot of time and money chasing it down. I mean, you can't emphasize enough how some of that stuff really does have significant impact. And it's not just the cost up front, but what we found with going through that is that it will make the whole diligence process go smoother and faster, so you're not at disruption to the business. I mean, you think about anybody that's been through a process, either buy side or sell side, knows how disruptive a process can be. And there's ways to minimize that disruption to your business on a go-forward basis by doing some of that dive. It's money well spent in overall process. And depending on how you do that, whether it's internal or external, it's always good to have an external party. You have the external party, you can put it in a data room and release it to people and show, okay, here's where our compliance pieces are. The other piece I'll add here, so now we're in a point in time where there's been waivers on things that you're allowed to do in COVID that you're not normally allowed to go through. I strongly suggest that everyone document when that started in your area, know when it ends, make sure your staff are clean, are going forward, and keeping back to the original rules when you get there. Because if you're looking at potentially selling a business a year from now, and you have to go back and somebody pulls a record and they say, well, you didn't do something right from a compliance perspective, but you have the documentation said, no, the stay-at-home order was during this date to this date in my area. Here's where I had it. It's in the records or it's in some kind of file. You'll save yourself a lot of trouble. And again, not just from a potential buyer, it could be from a government entity that's going to come and do an audit that it's nothing to do with a buyer-sell transaction that you need to have that for. I mean, similar to what I keep equating it to, similar when Katrina hit the New Orleans area and Superstorm Sandy hit the New York area, those restrictions, the things lifted, but then you go back and do diligence on a transaction later, you have to know what that detail is and you have to have it documented to make sure you understand. So it really is all important pieces when you go looking at a transaction.
Yeah, I'll echo that as well, Mike. I think that even in a trend that sort of even predated COVID over the past several years, I've seen buyers who are a lot more willing to walk away than maybe they would, or at least try and restructure the deal in a more significant way than they would have several years ago. Whether it's a compliance issue for a Medicare home health agency, or a travel time or a DOL issue from at a Medicaid personal care company, a lot of these folks are just not, and maybe that has something to do with the fact that from a regulatory perspective, we're seeing more stock transactions than asset transactions than we used to. A higher percentage of our deals, buyers are buying stock. And from a liability standpoint, that brings on a whole other indemnification structure, and you start to restructure that thing. One, the seller gets nervous, and the buyer is maybe rethinking this, especially when there are other attractive assets out there, unless you got something really unique. So
I'll just add very quickly that to the degree that you can avoid surprises through the due diligence process, you want to be the repository of knowledge of your organization. And if that's due to either a management structure or that you just haven't looked at things from that perspective, it's overdue. And the quicker you can make that deal go through, and in some ways it's just like real estate, right? Those pre-approved folks for mortgages, they get those houses faster. If you've got stumbling block upon stumbling block, that may be resolved, but if it drags out the deal, you're lowering the percentage of success in getting that asset sold.
Perfect, guys. Leads us right into the next question. Brian and Mike, I'll push it towards you guys. Will strategic buyers prefer smaller underperforming providers to purchase, or will they be looking more at stronger performers going forward? And same for private equity buyers. And we'll start with Brian this time, since we started with Mike last.
I think that's segment specific. I think that in the Medicare home health side, again, I mean, we've got a lot of the strategics I'm talking to have structured whole teams around being able to absorb some of these providers that are in trouble. So I think it was Mike earlier that said, it's better not to wait till you get to that point. Unfortunately, too often people are calling me too late in the process. So I think, given that there's those opportunities out there, I think they're going to be a lot more selective in Medicare home health. from a strategic side. Equity guys are probably less likely to have that ability. And so I think that they're going to probably, those folks will continue to do the same kinds of transactions, albeit a little more cautiously in Medicare home care. Medicaid, to be honest with you, we've seen a ton of activity across the board. Platforms in the right states are Medicare personal care are commanding valuations that are as high as we've ever seen them. But I think that there's at least the perception is that there are going to be a lot of these small to mid-sized providers who, as managed care penetration continues, get squeezed out, don't have the sophistication to negotiate these contracts, can't wait out the cash flow from, and will just end up being able to absorb them or pick them up for much lower multiples than these platform acquisitions and create a nice blended multiple strategy. On the hospice side, I think maybe a little too early to tell. Those valuations have remained pretty steady. Mike, I don't know what you're seeing, but they remain pretty steady across the board, depending on size. Obviously, larger assets and restrictive CON states are worth a little more. But those valuations really haven't not seen a whole lot of movement yet in that space, either direction.
Yeah, and I'll agree with a lot of your comments and add to them, Brian, some of these scenarios. So when you look at what strategics are going to look for there, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, the strategic buyers are going to look for, for underperforming assets. They'll look at them only in scenarios, especially if I start with Medicare home health. They're going to look at assets to get into states they don't have, which is what Brian had talked about. They're going to look for key leaders. I think some of the areas I'll add to that is that if they see a smaller asset that has a great leader that's running it, they're maybe more attractive to them than one that's just going to be folded into the organization. When you look at hospice is totally different when you look to compared to certified home health with the strategies you're looking at. They're more likely to go after something that's underperforming if it gets them markets they're looking at, especially when you look at some of the key strategics at this point. If you listen to their earnings calls, if they have a home health location that's already in a site, in a location, they're going to try to put a hospice with it. They'll look at something that may be an underperforming asset that may have the same valuation. And to what Brian had talked about, valuations haven't changed much. I think they'll change some, but not significantly from where they were. The PE buyers are going to look at it differently. So if you look at a PE buyer, they're not going to look at an underperforming asset as a platform. Most of these PE buyers need to get into it to get their platform. But they may look as an add-on, depending on how they're looking at it, to add to that scenario. So they may look at an underperforming asset if it's possible to do it an add-on, as long as they have a strong leadership team. I think a lot. Again, I'll echo the leadership team piece. If you have an asset, you have a strong leadership team that's there, and the PE guys can see that they can bolt that into something they're working on and add value. The PE world's looking to add value in everything they do. So if they can go through that process and add to it, that's going to be critical to them. And then if you think about the non-certified home cares, those you're going to, I think Brian's right, those, especially in the COVID world where a lot of those had staffing concerns going forward. Now there's high unemployment and those groups have ability to scale. You're going to see both the strategics and the private equity jump heavily into that. With especially in markets where they think there's opportunity where people either can use private pay or the Medicaid programs are reasonable in those states to move forward.
Thanks, Mike. Let's switch gears a little bit. So pre-COVID, the talk was all about PDGM, at least on the home health side. Let's talk about that, what that means today going forward, post-COVID or whatever COVID, what it looks like with the world going forward with COVID. How does that change the M&A landscape, and what does PDGM look like, and with all the stimulus packages coming in, and as that starts to burn off, what does the world look like with PDGM going forward, and what is we've talked about this, Mike and Tom. This is addressed to you all. And Tom, why don't you go first? But we've talked about this, Mike and Tom, about how this is kind of masked the PDGM effect. But what does this mean going forward? And Tom, why don't you start?
Sure, I'll start, and obviously Mike's in touch with these folks on a daily basis as well. It's interesting what we're hearing from the providers out there is that initially, and this is an aggregate, not there are certainly cases to the contrary, but that the impact from PDGM was not as dire as initially thought and predicted. one area, and Mike, I really wish you would expand on this. I know you've dealt with this a lot, is we expected looper rates to go up, but in essence, I think they've doubled. So as you work your way through the process, the length of an episode with the periods, you're starting to see things pop up and stress testing, for lack of a better way. We're not seeing the decrease in therapy utilization that we thought. I think I saw in a poll last week, it said that 75% of providers didn't think that there was a decrease in the utilization of therapy. 25 did, but the amount of therapy being provided was not nearly as impacted as everybody thought. The financial impact, it's still there. And I think it's a little difficult actually to separate PDGM from COVID, because we were just coming through because you've got PDGM, you've got the change in wraps, et cetera. And then COVID hit, and CMS pumped a lot of money into the system, and then had very, no strings attached, and then they've had revisions and the confusion that's coming from that. It's awfully hard to separate the two, but I think we're going to see, so it's created a pause in the aggregate for Medicare providers of home health on what's the true value. I think we have seen these folks that just are closing up because they just don't have the cash flow. I think we're still going to see the same number of deals as a result of that. I think it's going to be compressed, certainly in the last 6 months of this year and into 2021. Mike, thoughts?
Yeah, and I'll add on to what Tom's saying, and I'll go back to a session that Brian and I did at the National Home Care and Hospice meeting in Seattle. We did an M&A session and talking about how PDGM we predicted PDGM would affect things, and again, not understanding or not knowing that COVID was going to look at it. If you look back at what we said in the fall going into the winter, we said, look, the PDGM had slowed deal flow in certified home care. And we did see that happening to the end of the year. People were a wait and see process. Didn't matter if you were strategic or you were a private equity buyer. We saw things slow because we wanted to see how it played out. We also predicted that cash flow would become very tight as we went through a transition in February, March. What actually happened? So the cash flow got tight, and then COVID hit. So you had all these groups that were looking at processes or looking at going to market or determining how that was going to take place, that we're ready to start looking through this being forward. We did, number one, see CMS did a better job, and I was a big critic of the process, saying that CMS would have a hard time processing claims. That actually has been better than what we expected. It's not perfect, and there were glitches that took place. So that was actually going to be positive to the M&A market. Then all of a sudden you get to a situation where cash would just start to be, if you look back at those presentations, cash was going to start being tight March, April timeframe, and all of a sudden we have COVID hit, and we get advances. So that masks the PDGM effect, and I think it masks some of the M&A market process on that because it slowed it down. So a lot of the market, I think, is still in a wait and see, especially in certified home care. We don't have everything that everyone put in place for PDGM. I won't say it totally got thrown out the window, but it did get thrown out the window to some extent because you had to figure out what you needed to do to run your business and not worried about the other pieces and related to cash flow. So when you looked at that overall with COVID coming in and all this deal flow, it slowed it down, but I do think it's going to come back. And what's going to happen next is, we'll talk a little bit later in this presentation about these cash advances and how they affect M&A. When you look at cash flow, you look at revenues decreasing, because in some areas of the country, you've seen 30% of the home health volume drop off. That's not going to help anybody trying to sell a business, because that's obviously, they're looking at trailing 12 months of revenue that's going to be affected. You're going to need to, if you're an owner looking at this right now, you're going to need to determine what would your new volume be. Was COVID just a blip? How can you forecast that process and then show your impacts of PDGM and try to separate it some, which is very, very hard. I know I'm trying to put that crystal ball out there, and how do you do that? You need to be able to figure out how to separate those pieces so you can work to determine what your run rate going forward would be.
Well, let's dive into the cash advances now. Before we do that, anything else on PDGM and how it's affecting the M&A landscape, Brian or Tom?
This question was directed to me, but I think it's probably more appropriate for Tom and Mike. It's a question about are we still seeing the conversations that you guys are having with health systems, and we had a rash of joint ventures sort of all bundled together at one time. Are those conversations still happening? Is that still of interest to providers, or what kind of conversations are you having? So you guys are a little closer to the ground on that than I am on the joint venture side. So I thought it was
Brian,
an interesting question.
I'll start, and then Mike, please. Actually, it's been interesting. We're seeing a lot more interest from health systems on what the possibilities are for their post-acute networks. It's just, as everybody knows, the COVID crisis was a cannonball that went off in the financial operations for health systems. The amount of furloughs and layoffs, thousands of folks have been getting laid off, and they're trying to figure out a way to get money in the door. Folks that would never have thought of either partnering, either in a minority or majority role or outright sale. We're actually having discussions now with those folks. It's remarkable. In hindsight, it shouldn't be unexpected, but how quickly that conversation picked up.
Yeah, I think I'll add to what Tom's saying. From the joint venture scenario and some of the processes related to it, you are seeing groups or health systems that need to find cash or need to find assets that have value, because these health systems have lost significant dollars, a lot of it related to the elective surgeries that they're not doing. So in a scenario, I've been in conversations with health systems that are looking at what to do and what assets have value. The home care and hospice tend to have value in this market, so they may be looking to joint venture through process. I think that you saw some joint ventures slowing a little bit, and now I think with this process, with some of the uncertainty in the market, there's a lot more out there than would have been prior. Now, it doesn't mean they're going to fully transact. Just because they're having these conversations doesn't mean you're going to see them transact fully, but they're at least getting into conversations to listen to more of something that they may not have paid attention to prior.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Hey, Brian, let's take a step back and talk about home care, hospice, and behavioral health, Medicaid. You've touched on some of this stuff, but the M&A demand perspective and more of that side before we move on to some of the other topics and get into the Q&A. We're kind of reaching the end of our prepared comments, but if there's any final comments you want to talk about on Medicaid providers.
We haven't talked a ton about behavioral health and specific to IDDD providers. It's probably a little too early to tell. There are a lot of transactions that have been put on hold just because of the challenges that diligence and employee meetings and those kinds of things, managing advocates and guardians and whatnot, has become really, really difficult. Those providers are dealing with their own set of challenges, particularly as it relates to day service or day programs, and how to manage transportation and all those kinds of things in a COVID world. So, but there's a lot of pent up transactional volume in that space, and I think that the interest in that space will continue, because I think it's emerging both for strategics and for and this is sort of specific to geography, for strategics and for equity-backed platforms, as a real stable force, sort of post-COVID, as maybe they're looking for alternatives, where to put some cash to work. Medicaid personal care, again, I'll just repeat what I said earlier, is that we've seen a tremendous amount of interest, particularly in platforms in the right states. It's a little bit of a land grab to secure the platforms, because I think everybody thinks there's going to be continued consolidation in those areas. And so as we see, we're seeing a lot of those groups enter new states as they've kind of realized that that's a real stable long-term revenue stream. It's not quite the bucket with holes in it that we've always sort of thought about Medicare home health being. So those spaces have remained really, really stable. And again, in Medicaid, specific to Medicaid personal care, we're still moving forward with those deals. And we're doing a lot of things virtually and virtual diligence and those kinds of things, but that has not stopped the transactions in that space. So that's been an interesting process, especially as those guys continue to grow through the challenge here. So.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. And that's true as the rest of the behavioral health segment that we serve as well. So we're still having closings. So it's been an interesting 10 to 15 weeks. Last question.
Rich, if I can add real quickly in this one on the behavioral health, I think one thing that's really important to think about when you're looking at human services behavioral health providers, some of them have seen significant revenue increases. Because of the biggest area that we've seen is that you get to these no-shows on appointments for the patient populations that are there. Adding telehealth to that means that they're all of a sudden their revenue is more guaranteed because they're more likely to get on a telehealth group or some kind of group. If there's a group therapy or whatever it may be, there's a lot of that human service provider where you're seeing increase in revenue and a lot of the funding's increased as well. So that's going to be an important factor when you look at M&A.
Yeah, and just with the nature of what the therapy was in the addiction treatment centers, a lot of them, the treatments needed even more with the disruption of their lives and the COVID and the shelter in place. The demand for the services has been higher as well. So we're actually seeing a lot of our clients have higher demand for their services, higher revenue. So where people expected even private pay to be down, we've seen higher demand for the services from a not a pricing perspective, but from a volume perspective, even during COVID. So it's been pretty from an M&A perspective and from a valuation perspective, that volume has stayed steady, maybe even improved, as well as the multiples of the buyers have been interested in this now. They're still pricing deals at the same multiple. So it's been encouraging from that perspective as well. Guys,
valuations have increased sort of correspondingly, because as your volume increases, you become a bigger provider and you move into that sort of that next range of next valuation band. So I think we're seeing some of that happen as well.
That's perfect. Brian, if you want to mention anything, I want to leave a little bit of time for Q&A, and we got a couple of these. If you wanted to talk anything about group homes versus waivers on the IDD side, or
I think it's probably a little too early to tell. I know that we're continuing to see some movement in that direction. And that's very state specific. Those programs, waiver programs in the states that are doing it successfully, have seen tremendous growth, and are as they sort of work through waiting lists in some of these states, see a tremendous amount of interest. Doesn't mean it's not without its challenges. We just had the largest provider in the state of Arizona file for bankruptcy. So it's not without its challenges, but we are seeing it's an aging provider population. So folks are the challenges of this have kind of pushed a lot of folks who've sort of been on the fence for maybe a year or two over the edge, saying, I don't want to go through this again. This is hard, and this business is hard enough. And the folks that have significant size and infrastructure can absorb those pretty easily. So I think that will continue. We'll see a lot of consolidation as people put these two together, and there's going to be some large transactions. We're seeing some big transactions, so where most of those were $3 to $5 to $7 million historically. The bulk of the ones now that we're, at least the ones that we're working on, are anywhere from 10 million in revenue to $40 or $50 million in revenue. And those are ones that have been in the business for a long time, and a lot of them have multiple presence in multiple states to help diversify their risks. So it seems like a safe place, and it's attracted quite a bit of interest. So.
Okay, so the Q&A questions are coming in. Oops, hit the wrong button. I will tell you guys, I don't get nervous because we speak a lot in front of people. I was a little nervous today because I'm in charge of the technology. So
I was a little nervous about that too. Watching you do it. So
that was unanimous.
The fact that I've made it through this without turning everybody off is actually a big win. So some of the questions coming in, and we had one pre and one at the same time here, about the difference between a franchise private pay home care versus a non-franchise. Jim has asked this question. I don't know if Brian or one of you want to answer it. I think he's looking for valuation differences between franchise versus non-franchise private pay home care.
I can speak a little to that. Historically, we've done very little volume in the franchise space because a lot of the buyers that we deal with already have a platform and do not want to operate it as a franchise. They don't want to be a franchisee. They want to use their own systems. That's changing a little bit. I can say that because I've got, for the first time, we've got some significant inventory of franchise provider, home care providers that have really good size to them. But the buyer pool is different than is what we've historically seen as buyers for private pay home care operations. Doesn't mean that they're not out there. It means it's a smaller pool. But I think that there are some folks out there who historically may not have been interested in home care, but see, and particularly if you have some size, understanding that the franchise home care, private pay home care business is consistent. It's a very fragmented market. It's a lot of very small providers. If they could get hold of one that's large, they're by default, there are a lot of potential add-on acquisitions in other franchisees that have smaller operations who may be thinking about getting out. So we've seen a renewed interest in that really haven't seen in a lot of years. And again, I've just got direct experience there now because we're marketing some very sizable private pay franchisees that we just haven't seen hit the market before. So. As far as valuation, we have seen obviously the margins for franchise operators tend to not be quite as good as non-franchise participants. So the valuations just aren't as good, unless there's a way out of that franchise agreement, and then it opens up a whole different pool. Most of the franchise agreements I've seen are pretty ironclad. It's really, really hard, if not impossible, to sell outside the franchise system. So it limits your pool of buyers, and it does take a downturn in valuations.
So. Next, unless anybody has anything to add, next question. Brian, someone want to know, can you tell who the Arizona provider was that went bankrupt?
CPES.
That was pretty easy. And then I'm not sure what
they filed. That's all we know at this point. So.
And then there was a question here from Daniel. He asked if there's any update on Honor and their business model. I haven't heard anything recently. I don't know what he's getting at. If there's something, I don't know, Mike, if there's anything, have you heard anything from Honor? If they've changed anything? I mean,
I haven't had a lot of interaction with them, but nothing that I've heard out there.
Yeah, nothing's changed. Tom?
I think they went back out for more funding, but beyond that, I wasn't sure of any change in their market, go-to-market.
Yeah, I think they've been having relative success in what they've been trying to do. It's a very interesting model we've been watching, but I haven't heard anything new relative to what I would call the last 6 months.
Yeah. Brian,
how about you? Anything?
No, I haven't had any interaction with them in probably 6 to 10 months either.
Very interesting model, but I haven't heard anything new in 6 months plus, to be honest with you.
Okay. Question I have for the group is, 2 weeks into COVID, did everybody anticipate that across the board, 12 months from now, we'll see, I think all the market segments we're talking about are going to see an increase in volume of business, right? With the delay in elective surgeries and that backlog, behavioral health issues as a natural outcome of COVID, and hospice, across the board, I would never have thought that would have been an outcome with this craziness.
I think that, Tom, the only piece I'll add there is, I think hospice, personal care, human services, behavioral health are all going to see increases.
Yeah.
When you think about the certified home care business, the numbers are down so drastically in areas of the country. It naturally should believe that you're going to see patients that aren't going to want to go in the hospital. I mean, I've heard numerous times that stroke and heart attack patients are not showing up in EDs in areas of the country, which is pretty scary, thinking that people are not having those situations, but they're doing it in different fashions. Certified home care is in a position to pick up lots of additional business with that.
And on the average, Mike, there'll be more severe cases.
That's right. So everything would lead to the fact that volume should be up as you work through it. And right now, it just remains to be seen whether people are going to let people in their homes. I mean, that's some of the bigger challenges when you look at scenarios. But if we're in a new normal when we get into the summer where the stay-at-homes lift and we potentially hit some kind of second wave, and we get into it where we're a little more familiar with how it works, I do believe you'll see it. It just still remains to be seen.
I'll think that just one kind of small but very meaningful segment, just because we haven't talked about it. It's seen a tremendous amount of growth throughout this, and that's as a result a heavy increase in interest from a buyer standpoint, and that's pediatric. In-home pediatric care, specifically medically complex and medically fragile children, for a lot of reasons. One is, as a parent, you don't want that kid in the hospital, right? It's not a good place to be, especially if you can't go visit. And so, whereas there always has been a tendency from whoever the caregiver is to overreact and re-hospitalize those medically fragile children, we can do a whole lot in the home now with technology, and since they're treatable in the home, they're staying in the home. And so the businesses that I'm working with, they're not losing hours to hospitalization, and they're able to recruit nurses in a way that they've never been able to before. Because if you think about the nature of that business, typically it's one clinician going to one home, treating one person, one patient, and it's kind of a controlled environment. And as long as you're careful, you can manage that. And so, and a lot of nurses would rather do that than go be in a hospital right now, to be honest with you. And so their recruiting numbers are way up, and their business is way up. So a lot of times their biggest challenge to growth has been staffing cases. So a lot of states have waiting lists for these types of services, and they just can't staff them. All of a sudden now it's got this influx of nurses who would rather do this kind of work than go into a hospital. And they're able to staff those cases, and so they're clearing out some of those waiting lists, and it's seeing a lot of interest. And those rates have been even in states that historically have had terrible rates or have neglected to provide increases for years, have seen increases in order to encourage providers to take these services on. So seeing quite a bit of interest, and evaluations are very, very high right now. So
Thanks, Brian. A couple more questions are coming in. Daniel wants to know if providers are passing PPE costs on to clients. Mike, I don't think you can do that, can you? I mean, if you're a Medicare provider, you can't pass that.
I think that's the Daniel I'm thinking of. I think he's speaking in private pay. Is that maybe Daniel? I think if it's the Daniel I'd see on there, I think he works with a large private pay only operation.
He says
yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I've not seen that yet, but I don't know that it would be unheard of.
No,
I am seeing them pass on any additional costs, because families don't want multiple caregivers. So as they start to incur overtime because they're comfortable with one person who comes in the same home every day, again, it's that sort of controlled environment, they are passing on overtime costs. But I've not heard specifically about PPE costs, Daniel.
Yeah, and I think what I've seen some in the personal care market is if you have an existing family that's been involved with, it's going to be hard to get them to raise their rate unless you have a situation like Brian's saying, is you have multiple caregivers in and you need to pay overtime in other areas. I think what I have seen a little bit of is that if you have high PPE costs in other areas and you have new clients coming on, that meaning that you have ability to increase your rates. And I've seen that happen some where personal care providers have increased their rates and people are a little more willing to pay it in this situation if they want somebody in, because it is hard in certain areas of the country, especially the areas in the Northeast that are heavily affected, to get anybody in. So to get somebody in, I think there's ability to raise in that scenario. And then the question is, can you hold it because of PPE? We may be in a different world where it may not be as price sensitive as it was before for families that want somebody in there.
I'll agree with you, Mike. I've seen that happening already, because there's a strong preference for taking care of somebody in the home versus a facility.
Okay, we got a couple more questions coming in. One on private pay agencies. Brian, you may be the right one for this one as well. Are you seeing more strategic, or are buyers looking really more to expand their current service geography, or are they looking to penetrate and get size? Like, are they looking for new area? Are they looking to do that traditional spider out, or are they looking to gain size within their current scale?
I think both are true. I've seen an interest in private pay pickup, over the past year and a half to 2 years for some large aggregators that really haven't been out there before. It's kind of gone in waves over the last couple of years. We're seeing a lot of folks who even historically pure Medicaid providers embrace that as a service if they can find the right size platform in the right area, right environment, and the right business model. Now, typically they're a lot more sensitive to, speaking to something that Mike talked about earlier, a lot more sensitive to what kind of leadership comes with it, because it's a little more a function of leadership and market presence and reputation and the ability to build those businesses, and that's usually invested in the management and the culture and those kinds of things. So that's a lot more important to buyers in that space than it is in some of these other ones. Whereas if you're a large Medicaid provider and you got $200 million in Medicaid, and you're going to take on another $10 million in Medicaid in an adjacent service area, you might not need the seller to stay on. The buyer may not need them, but from a private pay perspective, he's probably pretty integral to the business. So we're seeing a lot of situations where folks who've been in that business for a long time are taking some chips off the table, retaining equity, and taking some risk off the table, and then using the funds from an equity-backed platform to continue to grow the business. And they tend to know where the opportunities are, where the smaller providers who are either struggling or would entertain a sale are.
Thanks.
That was a long answer to a short question. I'm sorry.
Two more questions, and we're going to call it time for the day. And the first one, I want to keep this short because I think this is actually a topic we could do for a whole webinar all of itself. What are the pitfalls you see in today's deal point? What pitfalls, clinical pitfalls, do you see that can derail transactions? I don't know if each of you want to name one or two, but this could be a whole webinar that we could put together all by itself. But yeah, what are things that you see that you have a great transaction and then something comes up in due diligence from a clinical side that just kind of squashes the whole thing?
Well, the ABCs, poor documentation from a Medicare provider perspective, not having the signatures. We came across a recent discussion where software got updated and it wiped out signature physicians, if you recall, and that creates a real hurdle and a real headache. That the ABC just not having the documentation or not being able to access it.
So I'll echo and add a little bit to what Tom's saying, is not using the updated regulations. So a hospice that the CTI changed and the organization didn't change something related to regulations, a face-to-face issue where you need to have an encounter and there's not an encounter and it was a lack of understanding of the rules. I can't tell you enough times, make sure that your teams are fully up to date on the most recent regulations in your space, whether it's hospice home care, Medicaid home care, whatever it may be. Just that's the number one pitfall in my mind, that you get to error rates that buyers walk away.
Yeah, I think I'll agree with what Tom and Mike has said. I'll add something. I think the question was specific to clinical, but I'll add something just specific to home and sort of non-medical in-home care, because it just has come up so often lately, and that's compliance issues from a DOL perspective. And with courts continuing to rule for successor liability, even in an asset transaction, for DOL issues, buyers have become very, very sensitive to that, and it's starting to become a real serious point. So I would recommend having your house in order and your policies compliant, even having somebody take a look at them prior to even thinking about going to market, because that could derail it significant. It's just become an issue in almost every transaction these days. So.
And then the last one, we talked about this a little bit, but struggling providers, do you see them going out of business, or do you think they can be swooped up and purchased? The ones that are about ready to hit the wall, so to speak, as we say.
Well, and that's Rich and everybody else can chime in as well. Struggling, how much runway do they have? And can they meet payroll? If they're within 90 days, it's not probably going to end well. Their best bet is to find a partner to transition their personnel and their patients to. You got to be proactive, folks. You've got to be planning and looking out. If you're only looking at the next 2 weeks, that's not going to be a recipe for success.
think I'll agree with that. Is don't wait too long to call us. But in a lot of situations, that what the scenario Tom described makes a lot of sense. I've even done where for these assumption cares where the buyer will assume the accrued PTO, take over the administrative payroll immediately to help with transition, so take off that payroll burden. Assume their obligations under the leases, so there's not a severance issue, there's not a PTO payout, and there's not a long-term lease hold, and you quit losing money. So it can be the right scenario for specific people, but ideally you don't wait till you get to that point.
Okay, Tom, Mike, Brian, thank you. Everybody, thank you for joining Stoneridge today. Like I said before, this is a series. We'll be having our next M&A market update in August. So we'll be posting that on our website. This webinar will be posted on our website for those who missed it or for those who want to watch it again. I'm sure that'll be a wonderful way to entertain yourself if you want to watch it a second time. But please stay healthy. Please reach out with any questions. My email is rich@stoneridgepartners.com. Or if you have other materials or questions about this material, other materials you want us to cover in future of these series and these updates, we'll be happy to, or other topics you think we can cover. And I'll get back to you ASAP or cover these in future topics. Otherwise, guys, like I said, please be healthy. And here's to everybody moving forward and getting the country back open in a health and safe manner. Thanks again, Brian, Mike, Tom.
Hopefully the next time we do this, we'll have gotten haircuts. We'll be able to get haircuts again. So
we planned this 6 weeks out. I didn't dream when I've had a haircut in 12 weeks. So.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm good.
Tom, Mike, you guys are fun.
Yeah, I'm good. I'm all good.
Thanks, guys.
Take care.
Next time, let's work on the nuance. Yeah.
See you guys.
Bye.